really actually accepting your dog for who they are and letting go of this idea of who you think they should be, and I said, like, or who you thought they would be before they came into your life it's really freeing, and it really can let you let go of a lot of baggage and actually just love your dog and focus on how you nurture them appropriately, because they're not here long enough
Yes.
to spend years
Yeah.
trying to reshape them into someone they're not.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of the second season of DogLab. This is Brian Burton. First, thank you to the tens of thousands of listeners who tuned into season 1. We had a lot of fun, and with your support, we won the Dog Writers Association of America's Best Podcast of 2020, something we are really proud of and wouldn't be possible without all of you. Based on feedback, the theme for season 2 is the role of dogs as family members. The lives that dogs live now are very different than how they existed through most of human history. And while this comes with benefits for dogs, it also poses new, unique challenges. To help you navigate the season, the first episode is about Instinct's nature-driven nurture framework, which helps people parent their dogs in a very individualized way. We hope that by providing this framework, it's going to help you put all of the 12 episodes of season 2 into context. Information on dog behavior and training can sometimes seem very piecemeal these days. Our goal is not to only provide access to some of the top dog behavior people in the world, like we did in season 1, but help you understand these topics and how it fits into the broader picture of your dog as a family member. Note that you can get a free mini version of our Nature-Driven Nurture guide in the episode notes to use as a reference throughout the season, or you can pre-register for the Nature-Driven Nurture course at our online school at onlineschool.instinctdogtraining.com, launching by hopefully the end of February. The course is much more in-depth and includes bi-weekly, which is every 2 weeks, drop-in Q&As with Instinct trainers, and access to our brand new Nature Driven Nurture Facebook group, so you have community support as you try to understand your dog better and nurture them in the best possible way based on their individual needs. Details on the course, as mentioned, can be seen in the episode notes. Today's guest is Sarah Frazier. Sarah is co-CEO of Instinct Dog Training, Inc. and co-founder of Instinct Dog Behavior and Training. She oversees behavior and training related programming for all Instinct locations and for the Instinct online school. She develops Instinct Inc.'s internal policies and guidelines related to training and operations and is in charge of marketing, communications, and brand management. Sarah holds a master's in animal behavior and conservation from Hunter College at the City University of New York. She is a certified dog behavior consultant, certified family dog mediator, certified professional dog trainer, and a Karen Pryor Academy certified training partner who has worked with thousands of New York City owners and dogs with severe aggression, fear, and anxiety issues. She has been featured as a dog behavior expert in media outlets including the New York Times, the New York Daily News, the New York Magazine, Martha Stewart, NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt, Pix 11 News, and many more. Remember to follow us on Twitter at doglab_podcast and email us any questions or topic ideas to doglab@instinctdogtraining.com. Finally, we are also trying something new this year by putting the video recordings up on YouTube in addition to podcast format. So if you like to watch your podcast, you can find the link in the episode notes as well. So without further ado, here is Sarah Frazier. Sarah, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm a little nervous.
Which is funny because you've actually helped host a couple of these, I think, in season 1. So yeah, that's you're in the hot seat.
Role.
So you're in the hot seat in episode 1.
Yep. Ready to go, though. Excited to be here.
Cool. So season 2 of DogLab is focused on the role of dogs as family members. And, to help navigate this season and keep everything in context, we are going to walk through the nature-driven nurture framework that we use at Instinct. So Can you explain what nature-driven nurture is and why you think it helps people parent their dogs better?
Sure. So, nature driven nurture, as you sort of mentioned, it's a dog parenting framework. So, more than just training, it's about training and care and how you nurture your dog. And really, what it boils down to is it's focused on nature driven nurture is all about helping people gain a deeper understanding of who their dog is as an individual so that they can then optimize how they parent their dogs in a way that works with their dog's individual needs and personality traits. If we want to boil that down a little bit further, which I think we'll probably get into as we go, nature driven nurture is about looking at the biological factors, individual traits, and past life experiences that make up who your dog is as an individual, and then using that to create and manage environments, relationship dynamics, wellness routines, and learning experiences that all work with that nature of your individual dog.
Yeah, very cool. And so I think, I do think that most people understand the concepts of nature and nurture and nature versus nurture. So I think most people have heard of these terms, but you know, before we get into the nurture aspect of the framework, why is nature important to understand before we ever start talking about how we nurture dogs?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think we all know that our dogs are individuals, but that somehow doesn't always translate into how we then approach training and how we approach care. And so taking the time to really step back and say, like, who is my dog? Who is this being in my home beyond what treats they like and where their favorite like spot to be scratched is? Who are they? What makes up who they are as an individual? And taking the time to understand that first, to understand the biology, to understand the individual traits, to understand how that dog's life experiences have shaped how they view the world and how they move through the world is going to dictate the type of parenting and care they need.
Right. And it's interesting because I think, there's a couple things that come to mind. So I know one thing is, we're talking about biology and traits and life experience. And, um, so it's a couple things that jump out as interesting to me. And the first one is, with biology and traits, using those terms instead of genetics. So like genetics has it's really big in our industry right now and everyone's talking about genetics, but why is it important, do you think, to use the terms biology and traits when looking at this?
Yeah, fair question. And I would like to preface this by saying I am by no stretch of the imagination a geneticist or an expert in heritability and biology and all that stuff, but do have a background in an animal behavior degree and have been doing this for a long time. So prefacing it with that statement, but the reason why we talk about biological factors and individual traits and life experiences as part of nature, keeping in mind that this is all very messy and there's really very few clear cut boundaries. Biology influences traits and it influences how we perceive like life experiences, and life experiences can influence biology and traits, and it's all sort of just this wonderful messy picture. But breaking it up like that is really nice in terms of structuring our thinking. But getting back to your original question, it's we do have to be very careful when we speak about using the word genetics specifically and sort of what's a genetic trait or characteristic. Because, there's things that may be heritable that aren't necessarily what we think of as typically like having a genetic basis. And there's so much more and genes are totally regulated by the internal and the external environment. So we're more comfortable using that broader term of biology and having that encompass more than just what we might think of as typically, quote unquote genetics. So looking at life stage, looking at sex and reproductive status, looking at breed and looking at family heritage and having that all fall under that biology umbrella, um, for us works well for then sort of teasing apart what does that mean for who this dog is as an individual and how they perceive the world. Does that answer your question or not
Yeah,
really?
no. Yeah, no, I think that makes a ton of sense, and I'm sure, like, a question that, people listening might have is, if my dog does come with, certain biology or, certain traits, are they fixed? Like, so why are we learning about this? So, like, a lot of times in dog training today, it's always about, like, we train the dog in front of us and we move forward, or so whatever the problem is, we address the problem. It doesn't matter what happened in the past. And it sounds like we're actually saying, like, stop, that's actually not the best way to approach this. So why is it important for someone to understand these aspects of biology and traits before we actually get into the nurture piece?
Yeah, that's I kind of got goosebumps when you're talking about it, but it understanding this piece is everything about how we move forward. And if we actually break out how we look at this, if we wanted to get into the components and get into nature being, biological factors and individual traits and life experiences, we could pull out and say, well, like, wait a second, according to the definitions of nature and nurture, life experiences should be nature, or should be nurture. And that's true. Like, life experiences are nurture from the academic sort of scientific definitions of nature and nurture. But for us and for dog owners and for us thinking about how we parent our dogs, life experiences to date really do become this indelible part of who we are as individuals and who we view the world. So if we really look at how we have structured nature driven nurture, nature is everything that happened yesterday and in the past, and nurture is today and moving forward. And how on earth do we know how to move forward and provide tailored care if we don't take into account who our dog is and everything they've experienced up until this moment, what they need in terms of environmental design, what they need in terms of wellness, what they need in terms of our relationship focus and relationship dynamics, and what they need in terms of learning experiences and how we structure those. If we don't take the time to really say, who are you and how has that shaped what you need to learn and what you need to feel safe and what you need to sort of develop and grow. Um, so move it. This is all about moving forward, but it's about honoring who your dog is and everything they've experienced up until this moment, to do that in the most effective, kind, sort of joyful way possible.
And I'll kind of put you on the spot here, but can you think of some examples where, common examples that we might see or other trainers might see where, you know, important factors in biology or traits or life experience is going to affect how we actually go into the nurture piece? So, um,
Sure.
yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, there's so many if we want to start to pull them out. And I think the thing I love about the framework, and as folks see a little bit more detail of some of the subcomponents of biology and of individual traits and whatnot, it starts to make it really easy to chart the roadmap and to see how we adjust according to different nature characteristics. So one really simple one is life stage as part of biology, right? How we set up an optimal environment or optimal learning experiences or optimal wellness routines for a puppy versus an adult versus a senior dog look wildly different. And that's when I think folks have a pretty good sense of already and know pretty well. We have to have different wellness routines for a puppy versus an adult because a puppy's bones are still growing. There's only certain things that they can do. They have to eat more often, because they're still developing. There are things we do with socialization, or with when we set up the environment, we have baby gates all over our house, and you might have pee pads in the corner, or you have potty balls on the door, and you have 10,000 toys around to make sure that their developmental needs and their biology needs are met as a puppy versus as an adult. So that's a really simple example. There's a million more, but I think that one probably resonates with a lot of folks as one example of how a dog's nature factors, directly influence how we optimize how we nurture them.
Yeah. And yeah, no, that's great. And I think the other thing that's probably crossing people's mind is when you mention breed. So I know sometimes talking about breed and what that means in terms of, how we interact with them or work with them or how we think about them, sometimes it's even a bit of a touchy subject, but
Sure.
is there, so for example, if you have a Jack Russell Terrier versus a golden retriever, like what are some things that you would start to think, even just start to, again, you still have to get to know the individual. So that's not, again, every dog's an individual. We can't take breed at face value all the time. That being said, they've been selectively bred for a long time for specific purposes. So, if you walk into a client or walk in to see a client and, maybe they are working on, potentially maybe let's say like their dog's not coming when called, and you have a Jack Russell who's chasing, little furry things, and you might have a golden retriever who's just not listening and tuning people out. But what are ways that breed might impact how you start to frame the nurture piece?
Sure. So yeah, and I think I do just want to again preface that by saying it's kind of like a sexy piece of nurture, but it's or of nature, but it's it's one component, and it is one component that will show up and matter to varying degrees based on the individual dog, truly. But but also to your point, there have we have landed on some commonly shared characteristics within a certain percentage of breed or breed group members because of pretty purposeful selective breeding. And I will say for anyone, for the breed group piece specifically, and for anyone who finds that really interesting, the book Meet Your Dog by Kim Brophy and Herd Legs Framework has done a wonderful job of diving into that breed piece more so than we do with nature driven nurture, but we
Yes.
still absolutely recognize it as a factor. But she's done a wonderful, amazing job of that. So highly encourage folks to go check that out if it's something they find interesting. But yeah, coming back to the ways it sort of maps onto how we might structure nurturing a dog. It's things like for the Jack Russell, it could be something as simple as saying, this is in his ancestry, right? Don't be surprised if he gets really excited about small furry critters and wants to murder them. And that's normal, right? Like what's normal can sort of vary by breed or breed group, and to not be alarmed if we see that, but to know that tells us a few things. One is it tells us some natural behaviors that are and instincts that are probably pretty important to him that we have to find appropriate safe outlets for because they're not going anywhere, they're in there. It also tells us some stuff about what his motivators might be when we're thinking about skill development and training. And it also alerts us to areas that we might have to be pretty smart about how we set up environmental design to impede performing those behaviors, maybe when we don't want them to be performed, and to encourage them to come again, like thinking about motivators, to encourage them to do what we'd like to do, um, and do what's behaviorally healthy for them. I'm just chuckling because the terrier examples are always good ones. um,
And for anyone listening, we're not judging terriers. We've had multiple rat terriers over the years, so that was part of the reason why I brought that up. So and I think the longer we've had them, the more you just start to understand, like that is, all of our rat terriers have loved to chase squirrels and little furry things, and some with different intensities than others. But there's no judgment on the terrier folks who are listening.
No, certainly not. I think, yeah, and so I think again, it's one component of many components, and breed tendencies or breed specific tendencies may show up in some dogs more than others. But just knowing having a bit of background and understanding about what might show up and not being alarmed if you see it, but knowing how to structure your environments and your wellness routines and your training potentially around that is really helpful.
Yeah, that makes
We
sense.
want to look at things like beagles and knowing that they're probably going to always shout their discoveries, right? Like, I have discovered something wonderful. And that's not a bad thing. It's part of who they are. And they're probably going to really enjoy sniffing. And they're probably going to find that like a really intrinsically rewarding, reinforcing behavior. So, best we provide them ways to do that and use it again to facilitate, like, how do we use that to actually give them more freedom and to make sure they're instinctually fulfilled, and all that good stuff. So
Yeah,
we could talk about it more. I think it's easy to get sucked down the rabbit hole of breed, but if we just say like it's on the same level as life stage, super important. It's like life stage, it's like reproductive status. It's one of many factors that can show up in different areas. And within the framework of nature driven nurture, it may just inform how we set up our nurture routines, um,
yes.
yeah, to support them.
Yeah, and then before we move on to nurture, in terms of the life experiences that is under nature, which again can it might seem like a little confusing, but I think it's like it does make sense why it's in there because it's everything up to today and yesterday's nurture can become part of their nature. But
Mhm.
like, are there some examples or an example where life experiences is like it's going to make you think differently before you start working with a dog?
Sure. Yeah. So, and this comes back to this whole nature is messy, and what we're particularly interested in, excuse me, is there are some life experiences that can be particularly impactful, not only on a dog's sort of worldview and their learned behavior strategies, but also on actually impacting their biology and their physiology and individual traits. And that can be things like, you know, early development and what sort of maternal care did they have, or what sort of rearing environment did they have, and was it barren or was it enriched and they had access to different like surfaces and noises and stimuli and whatnot, because that can actually have a very real, like, physical but very real impact on development and on a dog's ability later in life to cope with stress and how likely they are to perceive threats and all that kind of stuff. So, things like that really matter. Stuff like trauma can have a really lasting impact on a dog and how they learn and cope moving forward, and that might impact, what we recommend or the guidance we provide an owner in terms of the importance of, when we talk about environment, really working hard to manage exposure to stressors, because you probably do, because of those life experiences, have a sensitive soul, right? Have someone who's pretty sensitive to stress. And so, how do we manage that environment to really minimize harmful exposures to stress? And certainly, we can work on skill development and whatnot, but we also might need to tap into the wellness aspect of nurture and say, do we go down a veterinary medicine path here to help this dog because they have some compromised abilities to cope. So, those are some examples. Multiple instances of rehoming, things like that. Certainly, there's lots of positive life experiences that impact a dog's nature as well. The ones for us that sort of come to mind in terms of being mindful about setting up an appropriate nurture environment are some of those ones that could potentially have had lasting negative impacts when it comes to the dog's worldview and how they move through the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. So really, then, if we kind of take as we move into the nurture piece here. So with nature, we're looking at the biology pieces. We are looking at the traits. We're looking at life experience, and so we want to make sure we have a good understanding of that. And then we move into the nurture piece. And again, I think most people understand nurture, and I guess my question is, I think most people would consider dog training today as like a nurture component, or like, you know, that they're nurturing their dog through training. But in terms of this framework, how does it differ from, you know, traditional dog training, or does it?
Sure. Yeah, and it does. Um, absolutely. And nurture, if we think about it as a concept, is all about how do we care for and protect and foster the development of another being. And that is what we're doing with our dogs. I mean, we are essentially parenting them. They're dependent family members in our home. And so this word nurture really resonated for us about what really are we helping people do. And we're helping them nurture their dogs. We're helping them protect their well-being and facilitate their growth and development and make sure all their needs are met. Um, a part of that is what we think of as sort of typical training, but with a little bit of a different lens on it, potentially. So when we talk about nurture, it really is boiled down into four main buckets that then have some components underneath them. And it's how do we set up environments, relationship dynamics, wellness routines, and learning experiences that enable the dog to participate in daily life with people peacefully and happily, and that protect their overall behavioral health. So that learning component is where sort of traditional dog training would typically fall.
Right. Yeah, and I think you know, and what, and so I would agree. So like the like traditional dog training is like one bucket of four, and it's an important bucket. But what's interesting is like there's these other three that sometimes get overlooked, and like you said, like the environment piece, the relationship piece, and the wellness piece. And maybe we can just kind of touch on these for a second.
Sure.
When we talk about environmental design, you know,
Yep.
what does that mean other than, you know, having dog toys and, you know, maybe food puzzles and those types of things? What are the types of things that people should keep in mind when, like, you know, designing an environment?
Yes, good question, and I think it's an important one to clarify. And I would just like to say out of the gate, as we get into defining it, it's so much more than like dog toys and food puzzles. Um, and so it can refer directly to like home setup, but it also refers to how you navigate your neighborhood, the types of equipment you might use. Like it's really everything sort of external that your dog experiences and how you can play with that to basically tailor toward four objectives. So if we want to get into this and how we think about environment, environment is for any trainer folks who are listening, or for anyone who's listening who's a dog owner but maybe has a background in like education fields or occupational therapy or whatever it might be, environment is not everything, but it is a lot. It is so critical in determining or playing into certain behavioral outcomes. It really is what sets the stage for behavior to occur. And it's one of those things where we could take two individuals and put them in one environment with conditions that are optimized for their nature and that support maybe their learning goals, and we could put them in another environment that does the opposite of that, and we will get wildly different outcomes. Not they're with the same individuals. It's so important, and I think focusing on this piece for people can relieve a lot of frustration and stress about things not working. A lot of times it's the environment that's not working. It has nothing to do with their dog or with them not trying hard enough. It just there are environmental hurdles getting in the way. And so if we break that down and we look at, well, what are the things we're actually trying to achieve? For us, we include four main objectives in nature-driven nurture. One is focused on minimizing harmful exposure to stressors and threats in the environment. Because if our dog is frequently experiencing stressors, not only is that bad for them for a whole bunch of reasons related to health in terms of what that means for chronic stress, but it also means their ability to learn is compromised. There's a whole lot of bad outcomes that come along with being chronically stressed and being chronically exposed to too many stressors in your environment. So that's one, minimizing exposure to stressors, not eliminating. I do want to call that out. That's not the goal. That wouldn't even be an optimal outcome. Stress is like a normal, healthy part of life to a certain degree. But minimizing those harmful exposures is super important. The second objective is providing access to safe outlets for natural behaviors. And I'm not sure if we'll get into it, but if anyone's sort of learning more, diving into some of the additional nature-driven nurture resources that we'll give, natural behaviors are all those like instinctive behaviors or innate drives that are just so important for dogs to perform, to just feel okay moving through life and not be frustrated and unfulfilled. So using the environmental design, and this does play into a little bit things like having toy boxes and having comfy resting places and having easy access to natural environments to go sniff and explore and forage and all that good stuff. That's our second one. So we have minimize exposure to stressors, provide access to safe outlets for natural behaviors. And then our other two sort of go together. And these ones are especially important for anyone who's trying to work toward behavior change of some sort, whether it's learning new skills or whether it's changing an unwanted or harmful behavior. And that setting up the environment, this is nothing you actively are doing, but setting up the environment to facilitate good choices or desired behaviors and to impede unwanted or unsafe behaviors. So those are our four objectives. I don't know if we want to get into examples of them, but those are huge. And if they can be done well, they make a world of difference in creating sort of a safe, low friction environment for everyone.
Yeah, I think if there was, I mean, that all makes sense. And I do think if we could take even if just a minute or two, maybe to talk through an example where environment setup is important.
Yes, and would you like to do just sort of a quick example for each of the objectives, maybe?
Yeah, sure.
Or okay. So I think when we think about minimizing exposure to stressors, and again, this comes back to it's based on the individual, right? What your individual dog is going to perceive as stressful or threatening is based on their biology, their individual traits, and their past experiences. So knowing that it can be as varied as your dog's getting a little older, they're getting some arthritis, they're feeling more uncomfortable, all of a sudden, or over the past few months, they find walking on your hardwood floors really stressful every day. They don't have great traction. It feels kind of slippery and unsteady. And so that's a stressor in their life that may not have been there 6 months, a year, 2 years before. I think is a nice one. We can think about obvious things like a really noise sensitive dog moving to the city and like moving to an urban environment and being faced with a ton of stimulation and noise on walks. So all kinds of different examples and thinking through how could we make that better, right? How could we reduce the intensity or frequency of these exposures? And for something like the senior dog, it might be a matter of putting carpet runners down for them, right? And you've just made their environment far more pleasant and far less stressful for them just from that one thing. With the noise sensitive dog, it might be like we go out at certain times of day, we stick to quieter streets, we make a point to get in our car and go to the park instead of walking down one of the main avenues. So that's an example of those are a couple examples of minimizing exposure to stressors that hopefully help people kind of target their thinking in the right direction.
Mm-hmm.
Providing safe outlets to natural instinctive behaviors. I think we may have sort of touched on this one, but it can be simple things like, again, making sure you really do have toys and bones and chews readily available. That chewing gnawing behavior is so important for just dogs, not breed specific, just as a domestic dog behavior. Same thing with creating really comfy for the dog, desirable resting places that allow them to go hang out, because about 30% of a dog's time budget is spent with just being restfully awake. So making sure they have nice, easy access to do that. So those are just a few super simple examples there. Um, and then the facilitating good behaviors and impeding unwanted behaviors. This could be something like, I don't know, maybe we have a dog who jumps all over you when you walk in the door after work, right? Potentially. And so to facilitate desired behaviors, one of the things we might want to do is just put a treat jar and a mat right by the door so that when you walk in, you can start dropping treats on the mat, and that's where the dog goes instead of jumping all over you. But let's say you have like a really enthusiastic dog and they just can't help themselves and they just try to do it. Well, we say, well, how can we set up the environment to make that unwanted behavior more difficult? And maybe it's that you end up temporarily putting like a little airlock in front of the door, a little extra gate there, so they can't actually get all the way to you. You still have the treat jar, you still have the little mat, you can still reward them where you want them to be, but all of a sudden jumping on you isn't really an option anymore. Does that help?
Yeah, no, that's great. I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think that's going to help people understand that environmental piece. So, the next one is, I think, probably fascinating to a lot of people, and it's the relationship component. And I find this really fascinating, and it's definitely something that, in a lot of cases where it seems like, there's things that need to be adjusted in the relationship first before any other training is really going to be effective or take place. And so even assuming, like, we look at the nature, we set up the environment right, we look at the relationship. What does that mean? Because I mean, I know everyone has a relationship with their dog. I would imagine anyone listening to this podcast loves their dog and their dog loves them. But what are aspects of the relationship piece that are important for people to keep in mind and maybe work on?
Yeah, and this is a hard one to talk about sometimes, because it's such a personal thing, and as you just said, I mean, we all love our dogs so much, and no one ever would want to hear, hey, you have a bad relationship with your dog. And that's why a lot of what we talk about within nature driven nurture is relationship dynamics. What sort of dynamic do we need to set up between you and your dog to help them feel safe and feel secure, and feel connected to you? And I do agree with you. I think we can't, it's difficult to overstate the importance of relationship and of building the right relationship dynamic. So for us, this is not about being alpha or any of those kinds of terms, but there is a leadership element. But for us, when we talk about leadership and what type of relationship dynamic we want to help people foster with their dogs, is that you are viewed as a safe, predictable, helpful leader. And if we break down each of those traits, the way we say them is like a little mantra at Instinct, but it's, I am a safe human, I do no harm. I am a predictable human. I respond in a reliable manner, and I am a helpful human. I provide useful guidance and support. So to us, those are the relationship dynamics that we're striving for, to create a dynamic where a dog feels safe and secure and has that connection that they're seeking as a social mammal.
Yeah, and it's definitely important for especially people, I think, dealing with tricky behavior issues, which a lot of times can just be, really frustrating, or you live in a tough environment or whatever. And sometimes I think that, sometimes it can be difficult to always be predictable and always to be safe and do what the dog needs to do. And so I think it's always
Yeah.
important to realize that. And that doesn't mean you're a bad person, but it does mean that,
Mhm.
especially if you're dealing with stuff that's challenging, there might be things that you might need to take a step back and change, how you're interacting in that relationship. Because otherwise, if you don't do that, like, the amount of stress and other things that it's probably going to cause to the dog is probably going to erode any potential progress you're going to make on the behavior and training piece.
Yeah, no, well said. And I think that, we're all human. Like, we're
Yes,
never going to be
absolutely.
perfect at this. And I think the other piece that nature driven nurture helps us recognize is this isn't about heaping all of the blame on you as an individual if you're not perfectly predictable, perfectly helpful all the time. It's about also acknowledging that some dogs, based on their biology, based on their individual traits, based on their past life experiences, especially, may have entered into your relationship already totally predisposed to potentially view you or all humans as a hazard, to potentially view you or all humans as not particularly helpful or useful, based on that nature. And if that's the case, how do we proceed forward and how do we do the best job we can to facilitate their view of us as a safe, predictable, helpful human?
Cool. Yeah.
Yeah,
I think that makes sense, and I also feel like too it's actually one of the more fun aspects
it is.
of the nurture side, because even if you feel stuck in your relationship with your dogs, if you work with a professional, a lot of times they can make adjustments where if you really make an effort to change those things, and this takes time. It's just like with people, you're not going to fix a relationship in 2 days. That might have been a little rocky for some time, but if you can actually put that effort in, again, setting up the environment so it's easier for you and the dog,
Yeah.
over time, that can pay such big dividends. And a lot of times, like if you get the relationship in a right spot, or like if you're fortunate enough to have a dog where you had a really great relationship with them from the beginning, it's going to get you through a lot of things that might be more challenging, or that normally would be challenging for a dog. But if they have that strong relationship with you, it's going to get you through hurdles, in a way where if you don't have that, it's not going to be there.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, everything from sort of facilitating learning and increasing responsiveness to actually helping to compensate, not a replacement for, but actually, as you said, like helping to compensate for a tricky environment or for a dog who maybe has some compromised health and wellness stuff going on. It can really be that anchor for them that just sort of keeps them feeling safe and secure. Um, Absolutely. And I mean, I love this relationship stuff. And I think, again, just as we move on from it, knowing that if that relationship is sort of fractured or it's challenging, again, taking into account that, like, as we already spoke about, your dog's nature can play a big role in this. And a lot of this is about optimizing, right? It's not even saying like what you've been doing is wrong. It's saying we can do something different for your individual super unique dog to tailor your actions in a way that just do a better job, like positioning you as a safe, predictable, helpful human. So I love that. I love this piece of it. Of just really saying like what we do is dependent on the dog in front of us and who they are and what they need. It's not all about you living up to some, like one ideal standard of what it means to be a leader to a dog. That's going to look different for every dog
Yeah, and
based on
like
who
if
they
you
are.
and if you have like multiple dogs in your household, how you interact with them could be drastically different because that's what they need.
Exactly. You're always going to be kind. You're always going to be striving towards being safe, predictable, and helpful. But exactly how that manifests in day-to-day life is going to look different based on the dog. And there's a really systematic way of doing that and figuring out what needs to be changed or tweaked within the framework, which I love.
Yeah,
Yeah.
awesome. Cool. Well, that's good. Well, that's yeah, super interesting piece, and that sort of leads us into the last two, which is wellness and the behavior and training. So,
Sure.
I'm sorry, the learning.
Yep.
Um, but in terms of wellness, I feel like most people probably have a pretty good idea of this.
Mhm.
In terms of like diet and exercise and those types of things. But what are the things with wellness that maybe people aren't thinking about?
Sure. Yeah, and it's true. We actually use a very similar wellness definition to what you would use in terms of human wellness. It's about making sure that your dog's physical, emotional, mental, and social health are nurtured to a point where they can just feel like comfortable and fulfilled. as they move through daily life. And the components we break that down into, and I'm going to guess we'll probably stay fairly high level with these, are exercise, enrichment or natural behavior outlets. Again, more than food puzzles, not that food puzzles aren't good, but more than food puzzles, and really tapping into, as a species and potentially as a breed or breed group, what types of natural behavior outlets do they need to feel safe and not feel frustrated. Sleep, a big one for people and dogs. Alone time, primarily not because there's something, inherent about a dog where it's like they need to be alone to be okay, but because spending time alone is a part of being able to exist successfully in a human world. So alone time is part of that. And then healthcare, which encompasses, veterinary care and things like nutrition and at-home grooming and all that kind of stuff. So that's wellness. And I think really helping people understand that the reason for doing that, I think when we hear wellness, sometimes we do, to your point, just think of like exercise and feeding our dogs out of food toys. And it is more than that. And the benefits are more than that. It really is about helping to reduce sort of destructive or disruptive behavior that can arise when a dog's basic wellness needs just aren't met. And it does make learning easier, right? It does facilitate progress if you have specific training goals that you're working toward, and that just does make them happy. Like that's the benefit we mostly think of it, but it does increase happiness and overall well-being. So those are the 5 elements that we include under wellness for our dogs. And are there any specific areas, Brian, that you wanted me to talk about?
I think that's great. I think that's
Okay.
I think that's a great overview for this, and that leads us to our last bucket.
Yeah, last bucket, which is learning or life skills and behavior therapy. And so we finally are talking about dog training.
Yes. Right?
But talking about dog training in terms of what skills and abilities does the dog need based on their nature and based on your goals to share their life with you peacefully and happily, right? Like, how do we give them the appropriate amount of freedom? How do we include them in our lives in a way that they're comfortable doing so? And so when we talk about learning, we break it down really into life skills, and then for some dogs, behavior therapy. And so life skills is all about just like what it sounds like, but building certain competencies that dogs do need to have the freedom to take part in life with you. So things like we do patient and polite skills, which is just that overall ability to sort of exhibit impulse control and be thoughtful around things like food and toys and doorways and people and other dogs. Settling skills, so being able to just kind of chill out and relax and hang out, whether they're home alone, whether they're home with you, or whether you're out in public. Leash skills, because leashes are a reality in our modern life. There are leash laws, and your dog's going to have to be on a leash. So making sure that they're comfortable moving in sync with you, and the leash isn't a source of frustration or confusion or anxiety. And then off leash skills, or depending on the dog's nature, long line skills, and that's really all about. That one is really for the dog. It's all about being able to afford them the freedom of movement and the freedom to engage in some really important natural behaviors to just keep them happy and fulfilled and living a joyful life. And then the other component of learning is behavior therapy. Sometimes people might call this behavior modification. We're talking about sort of the same thing. And this is for dogs who have, fear or anxiety or aggression issues, or maybe hyperarousal issues. And for these dogs, for all dogs, but especially for these dogs, the environment and relationships and wellness pieces are huge. And the life skills piece is huge too. And sometimes for folks, I think within our industry, if we have dogs come in with fear, anxiety, aggression, a lot of professionals, especially behavior professionals, will absolutely focus on environmental management and whatnot. But But that life skills piece continues to be really important for these dogs because it's giving them basic competencies that they need to just move through the world. But behavior therapy is things like doing specific desensitization and counter conditioning around certain triggers to help change a dog's emotional response, or it might be taking a more sort of constructional approach and actually helping the dog build some skills where they have deficits related to like social communication and whatnot. So that's what we think of that goes in the learning bucket. And your dog's nature is going to influence like what do they like, so how do we motivate them, and how old are they, so how much time can they pay attention, and what's fair to ask of them in terms of levels of distraction, and are there any health issues, so we should avoid repetitive movements. Like every part of them is going to shape how you teach and the types of learning experiences or educational experiences that you provide them. And then I'm getting carried away with myself, so I'll stop. I'll stop for a second and pause and see if there's any questions.
No, I think that's great, and because I think that kind of it gets us all the way to the training piece, and it's like, and I think what like it is important because again, I do think when people work with dog trainers or do dog training, they jump to that last piece, and then us as professionals, a lot of times when we come into consults, like we are actually thinking about again, those nature pieces, and then all like the biology and the traits and the life experience. So how's that going to affect what we do?
Yeah.
And then even before we get to the training, like how do we have to set up the environment to facilitate behavior, the behaviors we want and impede the ones that we don't want? What are the relationships? Is the relationship good and strong, or is there opportunity for, it might still be really good, but are there opportunities for adjustments? What do we have to do on the wellness side of things? Again, taking into all of the nature stuff and looking at all of that, then moving into now we're going to start doing the training, but it's not even just as simple as we're just teaching like leash walking or sits or downs or stays. We have to consider all of those other things, and they should influence how we're doing that. So I think that that's like a really good overview. And I think that sort of leads me to my next question is, for people out there who, are listening to this and kind of learning about this framework for the first time,
Yeah.
and maybe thinking about things a little bit differently, if there's someone struggling right now with like behavior or training issues, like
Yeah.
what's some, like, I know it's hard, but what's one or two big things that maybe they should keep in mind, as they're kind of embarking on this journey with their dog?
Yeah. That's a tough one. I know it's a little bit cliche, but I think probably the whole like progress, not perfection, is a really good thing to
Mm-hmm.
keep in mind in terms of knowing like this is not about moving forward and doing everything just so, or expecting that of your dog either. I think like starting small, and this is probably getting a little too tactical, but anytime there's a lot of some like serious struggle going on related to a dog's behavior, both for the dog and for the person. Um, I do think that the first objective always is how do we, as creative as we need to be, how do we start with that environment piece first, truthfully, and try to create an environment where we are minimizing stress exposures and conflict as well, like between the relationship. And that might seem like there's usually a way to do it. You might need someone's help to do it. Like you might need the help of a professional to do it. But until you can sort of give yourself and your dog the ability to press pause and just like take a breath, it's really hard to jump into any sort of behavior modification or whatnot as we would typically think about it. So I do think that environment piece as a starting point is huge.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, no, definitely. And then I think for me, the other thing is like your dog is an individual, and you could have got another dog and did all of the same things, and your dog would not have had any of those problems. Like, and I've seen it happen. Like we see people where they had multiple dogs and the dogs are doing wonderful. They get a dog who's just different, and that doesn't work for them. I've seen fellow trainers who are wonderful trainers get
Mhm.
dogs where their environment or just isn't the right fit, or is not, I should say the right fit, but like it's more challenging for them. So I think it's important where if you are struggling, I think you are the path forward for sure. But there's so much of this that is like that is out of, that we don't have control over, and that is going to influence their behavior, and so we have to be smart about how we move forward, but always just remembering that so much of this is out of our control, and kind of relieving yourself of that guilt, because a lot of people do feel guilt. I think is it's just important to realize every dog is different, and most of the time it's not like you're intentionally doing anything wrong, but there's things that we can do to move forward,
Yeah.
so that's something I always think is important for people to know.
Yes, absolutely. Well said.
Cool.
Definitely
Cool.
agree. Um, and I think this is not related. I think I would like to say this, and maybe it's can be part of a sort of a wrap up thought. Maybe I can wait until there's a if there. I'm not sure how many questions are left.
We're almost done, so you go
Oh,
ahead. I'll,
okay.
I'll, I'll, I'll maneuver around you.
um, this is not related to that question, but I do think it's related to just sort of as people, if people find this interesting and they sort of step back and like it is a bit of a new way of thinking about your dog, and stopping striving towards this sort of like our dogs are here for a really short period of like too short a time, and I think oh it's really if we accept it doesn't mean we don't have necessarily have training goals or things we want to work on or help them with, but really actually accepting your dog for who they are, and letting go of this idea of who you think they should be, or and I said like or who you thought they would be before they came into your life is it's really freeing, and it really can let you let go of a lot of baggage and actually just love your dog and focus on how you nurture them appropriately, because they're
Hmm.
not here long enough
Yes.
to spend years
Yeah.
trying to reshape them into someone they're not.
Yeah, absolutely. And, um, yeah, I think that's tough because, I think back to my earlier trading days, and it's like, definitely did that, and
Mhm.
one of my bigger regrets. So yeah, yeah, that was a punch to the gut, but it was a,
Sorry.
it was an important. No, but it is important because I think that's why I'm so passionate about this and glad we're doing this in this first episode and setting this up this season this way, because I think we have the privilege of like have actually worked with tens of thousands of dogs that people don't have, and so you start to understand like not it's yeah, you embrace who they are and help them. It's
Yes,
like
absolutely.
and,
And I've
and
wondered about that sometimes too, about like that that really just sort of I don't know, like that magic connection between like senior dogs and their owners. And part of it's because they've known each other for a really long time. But I often wonder if part of it's because generally at that stage of a dog's life, you just accept them for who they are.
yes, yeah,
Right, and
absolutely.
you give them what they need, and you tailor their environment accordingly, and you just love the being that they are, and I think that sort of that acceptance, just it makes it so much easier to just move forward and help them.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, absolutely. Glad you brought that up. Um, cool. Well, that's good. And I think you kind of answered it, which is my next question was going to be if you had this framework before you were a trainer or as a pet owner, how would it have affected you, or what would you have done differently? And I think that was probably your answer. So
Yes,
yeah,
I think so.
okay,
Yeah.
cool. Well, yeah. Well, the last thing is, so we're making the mini guide to nature driven nurture. We're going to put that out there. That'll be in the lesson notes. Um, but for those who may want to continue like with the more in-depth course, again, the details in the lesson notes that it's the course and the included the Facebook group and live drop-in Q&As every couple of weeks. But for people who are considering signing up for that, like what are you hoping that they get out of it?
Well, I my hope is that people will get varying degrees of value out of it depending what they're looking for. I think as sort of a baseline, I really hope that everyone is able to walk away and think about their dog and their dog's role as a family member and what that means in terms of their role as a dog parent looks like. So I think that's sort of baseline. And then, truthfully, for folks who come into that course, it's not a training course, right? It's not like a how to teach XYZ skills, but it will actually provide people, and I hope people who come in with certain maybe training or behavior change goals actually do walk away with a very solid roadmap of how to build a nature-driven nurture program for themselves and how to think about those various components. So different levels there, but yeah,
Yeah.
that's my hope.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other thing too is I'm hoping that, in addition to that, like having the community of people going through this and seeing people who are, struggling with the same things that you are, or celebrating milestones or those types of things, like being a part of that and kind of working through this framework, I think is something that is going to be really nice to see as well. So,
Yeah,
um,
absolutely. I
wonderful.
hope people walk away feeling like they have experienced something different and that's something they want to go share with other people, right? Is that really rethinking like how we think about dogs as family members and what that means in terms of their needs, and um, really just sort of joining in this whole movement of, yeah, moving away from obedience and compliance and only, and thinking about, yeah, how do we nurture our dogs?
Great. Well, we're just about the hour mark, so I think, and that was all of my questions.
Oh, and
Oh,
and
and Kitty,
our
Kitty's
cat
ready now.
has announced that it's dinner time, so it's
That's a
time to sign
perfect
off.
time to end. So, all right. Well, thanks. All right. So, nothing else to add?
Nope, I think that's all for now. Lots more to come.
Cool. Awesome. All right. Thanks, Sarah. Bye.
Bye.